So our speaker for today is Alex Seleznev, an old professional acquaintance of ours who specializes in creating tax-efficient financial plans for people who are thinking about transitioning into or already in retirement. Alex and his firm, Capital Square Financial, also serve as fiduciaries and currently manage $127 million in assets for 62 families across 9 states. Alex's unique Fortress financial plan approach helps his clients feel confident about their finances, even in times of market turbulence, and gives them peace of mind knowing their retirement is secure. So without further ado, I'm going to let Alex take it from here.
Thank you very much, Susan. I appreciate the introduction. Talking about market turbulence, and we'll have a couple of slides on that. I mean, chances are we are going to experience quite a bit of it, which has been the case over the past number of weeks. And of course, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone is staying warm. I don't know what you think about this winter, but it kind of overstayed its welcome in my opinion. As much as, I have 2 boys, as much as we enjoy a little bit of snow every so often, it's just been, too cold over the past couple of months. So in terms of our seminar today, and I'll tell you, this is a modified version of one of my perhaps more popular seminars that focuses on pre and post retirement issues. This particular seminar will focus essentially entirely on post-retirement issues. I was thinking about how much time to spend on each slides and on each of the slides and on each topic. And given the number of questions that was submitted to us prior to the seminar, I actually counted 12 of them, and perhaps we'll have even more as we keep talking about everything. I'll try to cover everything as quickly as possible without necessarily going into too much detail. But of course, if you have any questions, please, put them in the chat box and we'll address them at the end of the seminar.
Well, Alex, let's have people put them in the chat. And I don't want to keep interrupting you. So unless there's something that needs immediate attention, we'll address questions in the latter part of the program, okay?
I'm in agreement with that approach, Susan. That tends to work best.
Yeah.
So in terms of the topics for our discussion today, we'll start with, some of the top estate planning considerations and gifting strategies. And at least in terms of our clients, in terms of our meetings, we tend to discuss those things more or less at the same time. One of the top questions I get from some of our new clients or even some of our existing clients, should I stay at home as long as possible in many cases in terms of my overall retirement plan, or should I consider transitioning to one of the retirement communities? And frankly, that by itself can be a seminar, but we'll try to cover as much as possible in 3 or 4 slides essentially. I'll touch on how to create a retirement specific plan, and this is really not meant to be an investment oriented seminar. So again, we're just going to touch on the basics here, and I do expect to spend probably 10, 15, if not more minutes on the questions that again came from the participants. I have them here and I included them on the slides, and any other questions as well. So with that, we'll start with the estate planning piece. Again, some of the top considerations for you to keep in mind. So in terms of how we would normally approach this, one of the questions, of course, our clients ask us, well, what documents should I have in place, in terms of making sure that my estate plan is in order? So at this stage in the game, I'm just going to make a blanket statement and say that everyone should have an updated will in place. And as basic as it may sound to perhaps some or even many of you, I can tell you that rather frequently we work with new clients, their late 60s, early 70s, and then you ask them, well, when was the last time you actually looked at your will? And one of the typical responses, well, that was 20, 30, 40 years ago when I first got married, when I had my first child. So really, this is a good time to update it. And again, we'll talk about how frequently you should do that, but it's important to do that. Perhaps for those who are less familiar, and it's one of the most basic estate planning documents when you essentially outline your wishes. That is what it's all about. You can essentially draft it, well, I want to say whichever way you want, but you can customize it depending on your personal preferences. And the bottom line is so that the state, upon your death, is not essentially making those decisions for you, which in many cases, I'm going to say is not likely to be to your advantage. Now, one of the most common follow-up questions I get, and actually specifically from those of my clients who are single, does applies to families, but specifically to my single clients, should I also have a revocable or living trust in place, right? So that really depends on your circumstances. I'm certainly not the one, and I happen to work with some estate planning attorneys who suggest it as a must, essentially. I don't think it's a must, but it's a consideration. So it will likely come with an additional cost to you in terms of creating the documents and making sure that everything is done properly. But in terms of the benefits, well, perhaps one of the top benefits is the fact that any assets, and that's important, any assets that you retitle into the trust avoid probate. We'll talk about some of the most common issues when it comes to estate planning. That is actually one of them, when people create those documents, spend a lot of time and money, and then they forget to retitle their accounts. The other reason, which perhaps people don't necessarily think about that much, that of course depends on the structure of your assets, but it's particularly important for those who are business owners, is privacy. So keep in mind, probate is a public process. So when you open in your new estate, essentially, usually you have 6 months for people in general to essentially make their claims, and who knows what that would look like, especially if there are any intra-family issues that do tend to happen every so often. So keeping it private can be rather beneficial for many people. The third reason, sometimes it's perhaps even more important one, is the fact that when you work on creating a living or revocable trust, you would have to, essentially designate a trustee or trustees would be responsible for handling your affairs, including when you're incapacitated. I'll tell you, in my line of work, the vast majority of my clients are, let's just say, in retirement, and rather frequently I do deal with their trustees. So it's important that everything is in place from that perspective. Now, you can, in some sense, replace that part. Perhaps that's not the best way of saying it, but that's how I'll describe it, by having a power of attorney, both financial and health, POA essentially. And again, if you decide to take the will approach, you would most likely want to have those documents as well, and they're usually prepared as a package. So if your son, your daughter, or anyone else is your financial POA, they would be able to communicate, let's say, with someone like myself on your behalf to initiate transfers, to make payments, do a variety of different things. Word of warning here, a typical or a general POA, at least that's my experience, is not going to work for most, or at least many, financial institutions. Most of them require that you complete their own paperwork. As an example, we work with Schwab Institutional, and anytime again we start dealing with the POA or trustee on a regular basis, there's a form you can complete. It doesn't take long, and it can be completed electronically, so that that person can reach out directly to Schwab, not through Alex, but directly to Schwab, to initiate transfers, payments, and access tax documents and all those things. Now, one of the, I'm going to say, popular tools, I'll describe it as such, is to retitle usually your brokerage account. This predominantly applies to taxable accounts or individual accounts, into a TOD or POD account. And that stands for transfer on death or paid on death. And that's a good way to transfer assets and avoid probate to essentially the next generation, perhaps your children, or can be anyone else. Usually, again, I'm comfortable with that approach when we deal with, I'm going to say, relatively small sums of money, and I'll let you decide what that means in your context. Let's say we're talking about, final expenses or things of that nature. And just to make my point, let's say you have $1 million, brokerage account, and you want to retitle it into a POA, or I'm sorry, TOD or POD to your son. Now, your son will receive the money, usually within 1 to 2 weeks. It can be done rather quickly. There's going to be 100% step up in basis, but there will be no other protection in place for your son. That is, again, one of the biggest benefits of having a trust in place, meaning that if someone inherits your assets in the form of a trust, there is a certain level of protection against creditors, of course, bad decisions, divorces. I happen to deal with that relatively frequently. So when the assets are in a trust, it gives you a lot of protection. One of the things I'm not including here, but I'll just make this statement. I'm going to say that applies 95% of the time. Creating a revocable trust does not reduce your tax liability. So if someone is telling you that you should spend, thousands of dollars to somehow save yourself some taxes, that is just not going to happen. That is not the primary reason why you would want to have this in place. So when should you revisit your estate plan? Well, the rule of thumb is every 7 years. And I happen to work with several, estate planners. They'll most likely say, every 3 to 4 years, just to make sure you stay on top of it. Again, you review, make sure it matches your situation, your preferences, and that's that. So that's up to you. The idea of reviewing your beneficiary designations, which was actually one of the questions that was submitted to us prior to the seminar, at least for our clients, we review them annually. Once you have everything in place, and I'll talk about that separately, it takes like 5 minutes to do it, but it can prevent, I'm going to say, major misunderstandings. And I'm using, gentle words here, but that's important. Of course, if you ever experience a major event, not to go in detail here, but if you ever get widowed or divorced, of course, that would be a trigger event for you to revisit not just your estate plan, but most likely your financial plan as well. If you change your charitable intent, I'll actually make a perfect example here. One of my clients who's been in retirement now for a couple of years, she feels very comfortable, and she recently visited the university she graduated from like 50 years ago. So now she wants to leave 10% of her estate to the university. Or of course, the documents need to be updated to reflect that. The bottom point here is somewhat outdated here. I wanted to remove it, but then I thought I'll just quickly describe it. So when the Secure Act version 1 and then version 2 came out, that certainly triggered pretty much a need to review, and in many cases revisit, many people's estate plans. One of the major parts of that, and again, that was one of the questions, if someone who is a non-spouse inherits your IRA account, the traditional IRA account, they now have to distribute the funds over a 10-year period. Prior to that, used to be over that person's lifetime, and if it's a younger beneficiary and her 30s or 40s, of course, that's a major tax benefit. That is no longer the case. So again, I'm not going to go in the weeds here, but what some of my clients decided to do, they actually made the charitable organizations the beneficiaries of their IRA accounts, because it doesn't matter to them, how they receive the money. And in terms of their taxable accounts, it's now their children, because there's going to be 100% step up in basis. So if they decide to sell your highly appreciated stocks, they will not pay anything. This is not any kind of advice, of course. All of this depends on your personal circumstances, but that was, again, one of those major trigger points. What are some of the top mistakes to avoid? Procrastination. And again, I'm sorry, but that is one of the top mistakes. No one wants to think about that. I don't have very many clients are excited about talking about their estate plan. Some are comfortable with it, but people procrastinate. And every so often, I mean, not to again get in the weeds here, but I had to go to someone's house to actually witness him signing the documents. He was on his deathbed, essentially. You do not want to get to that point. Beneficiary designations. Again, when you experience those events, it's important to update them. Let's say you have multiple children as an example. Let's say their situation is different and over time it changed. The most typical is, of course, to keep everyone, this equal percentage, but it doesn't have to be that way. So again, periodically updating the beneficiaries is important. The third point I'm inclined to say is not going to be all that relevant for this group. Again, I'll quickly say that. If you have any kind of life insurance, most people don't necessarily think of it as part of their net worth because they're just making premiums. But keep in mind, like in Maryland, as an example, the exemption is $5 million, as perhaps many of you know. So if the value of your assets, including your house and everything else, is, let's say, $4.5 million, and you also have a $1 million life insurance policy, well, keep in mind, if you die and it actually pays to your estate, you will now have a taxable estate. And in Maryland, by the way, it's 16% over 5 million. I mean, there are different brackets, but it's 16%. And then the fourth mistake, which is perhaps in some sense, the worst one, is when people, again, spend the time and money to prepare the documents. They analyze everything. Everything looks great. They execute the documents, and they forget to retitle their accounts into the trust. And it's pointless. Something happens, person, dies, people look at their documents and everything is in place, but the accounts are still under his or her own name, part of probate, essentially. And I've been involved in situations like that, unfortunately. All right, so switching gears here a little bit, even though this is, again, usually part of the same conversation. So gifting, and we'll talk about both gifting to perhaps your family members and to different charities. So I'll start with the basics here. So cash gifts and donations. Usually it's very simple, right? So anytime we're talking about small amounts to different charities, or let's say I have multiple grandchildren, and you just want to give them some cash for holidays. Usually I wouldn't bother with any kind of planning. You just give them cash, you keep track of it, and then you send the spreadsheet or some other document to your CPA. Now, in terms of giving perhaps larger gifts, and again, I will leave it up to you what larger means in your context. In many cases can be very beneficial tax-wise, not just for you, but then for the entire family, to gift appreciated stock. And I will describe an example in just a moment. Keep in mind, again, just to keep everyone updated, the annual gift tax exemption in 2025 is now $19,000. It's per person. So if we have 2 grandparents and let's say 2 children, you would essentially multiply it by 4. So keep that in mind. One other, not so much a mistake, but a misunderstanding. If you ever go above 19,000, let's say you decided to gift someone $30,000, in most cases, that's perfectly fine. The only requirement is for you to file a gift tax return, in your lifetime exclusion, which is again 5 million in Maryland at this point, and almost 14 million on the federal level, would be reduced by the amount above 19,000. So again, if someone wants to buy a home and you want to make a larger gift, don't feel like you're limited by the annual exclusion. So stock gifts. Again, what are some of the reasons why you would want to do that? Well, again, I believe in a couple of weeks, I'll be talking with a grandson of one of my clients who finally reached the age of majority, so we can actually create a brokerage account for him. So he will receive some cash, actually, in this case, but perhaps it's going to be appreciated stock. And the idea is for him to start getting educated, essentially, on how the markets work. That is, at least in my experience, one of the biggest issues with gifting large amounts of cash. You don't know what your grandchildren are going to do with it. Perhaps they're just going to go ahead and spend it, and that's fine, but perhaps that's not your intent. When you give them the actual stock, well, hopefully they'll keep the positions and perhaps even add to it. Now, in some cases, there are also tax benefits. So let's say we have Judy here, who's a grandmother. She's in a 25% tax bracket. Doesn't matter how we determine that. So let's say she sells $1,000 worth of appreciated stock. And let's say she had that stock for a long time. She bought it 30 years ago. The capital gain in this case would be $700. She would have to pay taxes, 25%, so $175 goes to taxes. So the actual gift in this case is only $825. Of course, keep in mind, if it's 10 times more, right, that will be 10 times more in terms of the tax liability. Now, on the other hand, we have Eric here, who's her grandson, recently graduated, still looking to get a job essentially in a 0% tax bracket. So he receives the stock, perhaps he keeps it, perhaps he sells it, but he ends up paying no taxes. See, the power of doing this, and I was reluctant to show you, examples with large amounts. I don't want it to be perceived in any way. But if you do this with larger dollar amounts for many years, it's a great way, again, to transfer wealth to the next generation. Stock donations, again, part of the same conversation, but now, of course, we're talking about charitable organizations here. So the idea here is to think of it as a double tax benefit. That's how I like to describe it. So when we donate stock to a charity, to a qualified charity to be specific, we get a tax deduction that depends on your overall tax situation. You need to make sure that you consult your CPA or a financial advisor who understands how it works. But at the very least, you would eliminate the capital gain taxes. So let's say we have Raymond here who wants to gift $5,000 to United Way. Let's say he's in a 25% tax bracket. Same situation, highly appreciated stock. If he sells the stock, he has a gain, $3,500, has to pay taxes. So the actual gift is only $4,125. So you would have to add to that. Or he can donate the entire position. All he has to do is complete some paperwork. It goes to United Way in this case. He receives a $5,000 deduction, which again depends on his overall situation, and there's no capital gain tax. Again, I don't want to go in the weeds here, but for those of you over the age of 73, it's particularly important because of Medicare premiums as an example. So when you sell too much in appreciated stock, it can impact your Medicare premiums. And in terms of your required minimum distributions, again, if you ever go in the next tax bracket, let's say from 22 to 24, perhaps not that bad, but then from 24 to 32, you have to be very careful about that. Again, we're dealing with relatively small sums here, so perhaps it's hard to see that difference. But if we start talking about larger amounts, it's entirely possible. So qualified charitable distributions, and I'm glad, again, we're talking about this in the beginning of the year because this question tends to come up at the end of the year when people deal with their required minimum distributions and everyone is essentially rushing to do this. So what are QCDs? That's how we usually refer to them. So these are direct, it's very important, direct transfer of funds from your IRA to a qualified charity. This does not work with 401k accounts, 403b accounts. It has to be your IRA, essentially, or rollover IRA. So the QCD counts toward your annual required minimum distribution. So at the age of 73, you have to take the funds out. And the goal here, so it's rather simple, is to satisfy your charitable intent and, of course, minimize your taxes. So usually it's easier to describe it as an example. So we have John here, who's rather happy, right, because we learned about the strategy. So John's RMD this year is $30,000, and he's in a 24% tax bracket. So he has significant charitable intent, and he transfers $20,000 of his RMD to different charities. It can be any number of charities. What are his tax savings? Well, it's his marginal tax bracket. In this case, it's 24% or $4,800 plus state tax savings. So in Maryland, it's usually 8%. In DC, it's also 8% and 6% in Virginia. Again, I'm giving you relatively small amounts, but imagine if you do more than that year over year, that can save you, again, a significant amount in taxes. What are the benefits of donor advised funds, or DAFs, which is how people usually refer to them? So the idea here is to create a charitable account that is designed to actually accomplish two things: to invest the funds that you contribute, and then eventually essentially transfer those assets to the charities. The contributions that you make into the DAF are tax deductible, or I should say potentially tax deductible, in the year of contribution. In most cases, you would want to do a calculation of how much you need to contribute to really minimize your taxes. And again, I personally never dealt with a situation when people donate cash. It's usually appreciated stock, so you can also eliminate any unrealized capital gains. The important part here, at least as we speak today, once you make the contribution, the funds can be distributed to the charities of your choice over essentially an unlimited number of years. They talked about capping it at some point, but that hasn't happened. So it's, unlimited number of years. So here's Marilyn here, who is also happy because she learned about the strategy. So her goal is to support her family, her favorite charity, and give them $5,000 a year. She knows for a fact she's going to do it for the next, number of years. So one of the options she has is to transfer $30,000 of appreciated stock into a DAF. She would receive a tax deduction of $30,000. Again, can be less than that depending on her circumstances. And that also eliminates any capital gains that she would have to essentially generate by selling the stock. Once that happens, she just sticks to her plan and continues to transfer $5,000 per year out of the DAF to her favorite charities. What I'm not including here on purpose, but again, the funds that remain in the DAF, they can still be invested. So over time, the total gift can actually be even higher than what she originally contributed.